What's happening, guys? Liam from Lazarus Personal Training. In this video, I'm going to talk about some common injuries that I see wrestlers picking up and potentially how we go about avoiding them. The worst thing that can happen to a wrestler outside of that dream that we have, whereas music's playing, we're getting told to go through the curtain and we don't have his gear on. The worst thing that can happen to a pro wrestler is that we are building up steam, we're getting booked on shows, training's going excellent, and then suddenly, out of nowhere, we pick up an injury. It can completely derail our momentum. And if we can avoid injury, I can guarantee 100% of us would do it. Now, in this video, I'm going to talk about some tips for training to help avoid injury. If you are in constant pain, if you have picked up an injury already, I would highly advise, if you haven't already, going to see a medical professional. This video is to help us prolong and stave off injuries if possible. We may still get injuries. Impact injuries can happen at any time. General wear and tear on the body happens too. But we can prolong not only our wrestling life, but our life in general through good and proper resistance training and mobility techniques. So with that disclaimer out of the way, let's get into the video. First point of call that we're looking at is the shoulder joint, and more specifically the rotator cuff. When we're looking at the rotator cuff, it is 4 sets of muscles. The main one that tends to come under a lot of strain and a lot of pressure is the supraspinatus. Basically, the rotator cuff acts to stabilize the shoulder. It attaches from the body to the humerus and keeps the shoulder joint in place. The shoulder joint is a shallow ball and socket joint. Basically, think of it like a tee and a golf ball. A golf ball is quite a big ball to sit on a tee. That is our shoulder joint, so you can imagine how unstable it can be. The problem with the rotator cuff, and specifically the supraspinatus, is that it runs over the top of the acromion joint, or basically our collarbone. What can happen is there is a lot of pressure that is put on that muscle and a lot of friction that is put on that muscle. So when that friction happens, it starts to rub against it, and just like anything that has friction, it's going to cause some wear and tear and potentially a full tear. So let's look at pro wrestling and how this might happen. Well, if we go to the fundamental of professional wrestling, what's the first thing on day one people are taught is how to do a back bump. And when we're taught how to do a back bump, we are taught palms down, slap the mat.
Where your hands are at. Turn your hands over and put them right next to you. Palms down. Put your feet down.
We pronate our hand and turn it down. Pronation of the hand leads to internal rotation of the shoulder. Now, there's no problem with internally rotating the shoulder. It is a natural bodily function. But however, if we're in poor positions, that can lead to pressure into the rotator cuff. So if you think the amount of bumps that you might do in training, the amount of internal rotation that you might go through, and then we want to look like a pro wrestler, so we're going to the gym, and what's the first thing that we do? Chest, shoulders, and a bit of biceps. That's going to internally rotate the entire body and pull our posture forward. That's where we put pressure on the rotator cuff. That's where the supraspinatus gets put under a lot of friction, and that's where potentially we look at getting a rotator cuff injury. The ways that we avoid this, I think, are building up our posterior chain muscles, especially our upper back. So our rear delts, our rhomboids, our lower traps, basically anything that's going to pull our shoulder blades back and together. Doing that is going to take pressure off of the rotator cuff. It's going to pull the shoulder back. Even if it's by 1 millimeter or 2 millimeters, that's going to make the world of difference. But building up our upper back muscles is going to help build some muscle mass in that area and give us some cushion to land on. As I mentioned in a previous video, I see a lot of young lads getting injured when they are in professional wrestling because they don't have the muscle mass on them. Rather than landing bone onto mat, let's get a bit of muscle in between that. And again, that millimeter, 2 millimeters of muscle can potentially make a world of difference. What I would also suggest with this is better shoulder mobility to free that joint up. My number one go-to for shoulder mobility that I recommend for pretty much everybody, and it is a staple of Lazarus Personal Training, is a shoulder dislocator. The shoulder dislocator with a band is just a really nice way of freeing up that shoulder joint and getting it moving and mobile. Moving down the body, let's look at the hips, and more specifically the sciatic nerve. Now, sciatica is nothing to be messed with. If you have suffered from sciatica, you know how crippling and painful it can be. And if you are suffering from sciatica, again, it's worth seeing a medical professional about, especially if that's constant pain. When it comes to sciatica and sciatic nerve problems, again, look at what we do in a professional wrestling ring. We take back bumps, front bumps and flip bumps, and we are constantly landing on our hips. That impact is going to make a difference, and it is going to alter the way that our structure is. The reason why we get sciatic nerve pain is that the sciatic nerve, which comes from the spine, comes down through the hip and down the leg. The hip is like a circle of bone with a gap in the middle of it that has some muscle and has a sciatic nerve running through it. If our hip position is altered and it is getting slammed into, well, then that can cause pain in the sciatic nerve. So how do we go about avoiding this? My number one go-to would be to increase your hip mobility. To free up the hips and make sure that they are super mobile means that we can take pressure off of that nerve pretty much instantly. If you can't move your hips, if you are completely locked down in that area, you are far more likely to suffer from sciatica than if you have a good range of motion in that area. A go-to for me would be a 90-90 position or a shin box, which is working on the internal and external range of motion through our hips. Another reason why we can get sciatica is through being in a lordotic position, a anterior tilt of the hips where our hips are tilted slightly forward. Again, this doesn't have to be by much, but a millimeter, 2 millimeters can make a big difference and can put pressure on that sciatic nerve. Women can often end up in a lordotic position, and athletic men can often end up in a lordotic position because we have tight hip flexors, tight quads and tight abs. It can pull our hips forward. Again, that mobility stuff is going to help, but training and focusing on making sure that we have good position when we are doing things like squats and deadlifts are going to be massively helpful to take us out of pain. The more mobile that we are and the better strength that we have are going to go hand in hand to avoiding that sciatic nerve pain. And then to finish off with, let's look at the knee. So the knee, again, often comes under a lot of pain, a lot of pressure, and it can often be a really debilitating injury. Now, the problem with the knee is that for the most part, it is an impact injury. If we're taking front bumps, we may be landing on his knee, but then also running, jumping, landing can all put pressure through that joint. If we look at the way that the knee is structured, it is two bones sat on top of each other. It is our femur bone sat on top of our tibia and fibula. The knee is pretty much under constant pressure. It has a small fluid disc that gives us a little bit of a buffer into it, but it's not a lot, and with wear and tear that can easily go. So a go-to would be to wear knee pads. That's going to help take away that impact. But if we're looking at moving, jumping, landing, the knee is a slave to the hip and the ankle. If we don't have the proper mechanics going on in our hip and ankle, the impact is just going to go straight into our knee. So what I would suggest for strengthening the knee and avoiding knee injury is working on our landing and deceleration. As you're coming down to the floor, can you shock absorb correctly, or are you just going pressure straight into that joint? Building up the muscles that sit around the knee is always going to be helpful. So better quad strength, better hamstring strength, making sure the calves are working correctly, and making sure that we have good ankle mobility. And this is where I think that training in no shoes comes in massively helpful. So as a brief run through of what I've talked through there, rotator cuff, I would suggest upper back work and shoulder mobility. For the sciatic nerve, good hip mobility and correct lower body posture is going to be massively helpful. And for the knee, can you land correctly, and are your ankles moving in good positions? If you're suffering from an injury or have suffered from an injury, is there anything that I've missed there that you feel like more people should know about? Let me know in the comments below. If there's something that you'd like me to talk about, please leave a comment, ask, and I will get around to doing it, because I have all the time in the world at the moment and I love talking about this stuff. If you liked the video, give it a like, maybe share it with someone that also would like to see this, and if you really like my content, subscribe to the channel. I've been Liam from Lazarus Personal Training, and I will see you next time.